Phyrexians are arguably the most iconic creature type wholly original to the universe of Magic the Gathering. Angels, demons, and dragons exist in countless settings, but the Phyrexians are only in Magic and have been some of the most prominent antagonists the game has seen. As such, these half-machine abominations have seen very many playable cards throughout the years. Despite existing in the lore for years, they're a relatively newer creature type, and several creatures from Magic's past have been errata'd into Phyrexians officially. Today, we'll be looking at 10 of the strongest Phyrexian creature cards ever printed. Starting us off at number 10, we have Chancellor of the Annex. This Phyrexian angel has 4 generic and 3 white mana, and has 5 power and 6 toughness. It has flying, which means it can only be blocked by creatures that have flying or reach, and whenever an opponent casts a spell, counter it unless that player pays 1 generic mana. If Council of the Annex is in your opening hand, you can reveal it and create a lingering effect where each opponent's first spell they cast of the game will be countered unless they pay 1 generic mana. Essentially, this is a big creature with a mana taxing effect that gives you a one-time version of its effect at the start of the game if you open up with it. Mana-timed effects that essentially force the player to pay 1 extra mana for a spell aren't the most powerful, especially when they're telegraphed so that your opponent knows that they're coming. But starting with one always online on turn 0 greatly limits the effectiveness of your opponent's opening turns. An aggressive deck will be forced to either play nothing on their first turn and then overpay for a 1-drop on the second turn, or cast a 1-drop on the first turn knowing it won't resolve. In formats like Legacy, where some of the best interactions available are spells that cost no mana to cast, tacking on that extra cost means your opponent can't force of will you with your starting play so freely. Of course, even within the first few turns, your opponent is likely to get around the effect of Chancellor of the Annex, since it only interacts with the first spell they cast that game. But the amount of delay it offers for no mana has made it a consideration for various decks throughout the years. One of its most consistent homes was Reanimator strategies, where you could reveal Chancellor of the Annex in your opening hand for the effect, discard it to something like Faithless Looting, then revive it with one of your various Reanimator spells. But even beyond dedicated combo strategies, wanting a bit of insulation and a payoff, vintage Hate Bear decks have opted to run copies of the card to offset your opponent in those early turns. The goal is to make your opponent stumble in those early turns to get maximum value off of one of their uncontested initiative creatures, and impede the blistering fast combo decks. Chancellor of the Tangle was also considered for this list as another member of the same cycle of cards that also sees some marginal competitive play. Chancellor of the Tangle gives you an extra boost of mana and is a green creature, both of which are important for casting Allosaurus Rider on your next turn and sacrificing it to Neoform to search up an 8-drop creature to win the game on the first turn. Ever since the banning of Simian Spear Guide, this combo has fallen out of favor. And conversely, Chancellor of the Annex has seen an uptick in play relatively. Coming in at number 9, we have Blightsteel Colossus. This artifact creature is a Phyrexian golem, costs 12 generic mana, and has 11 power and toughness. It has Trample, Infect, and Indestructible, 3 different yet very powerful keywords for a creature with stats that high. Trample makes it so excess damage still gets dealt to the defending player after blocks, and Indestructible means that it cannot die in combat or be destroyed. What really sets the cards apart, however, is Infect, which makes it deal damage in the form of -1/-1 counters to creatures and as poison counters to players. Since Blightsteel has 11 power, that means an unblocked attack is lethal in any Magic the Gathering format. If a player ever has 10 or more poison counters, they instantly lose the game. This makes the card leagues better than the card it's a homage to, since Darksteel Colossus is almost the same card, but lacks the Infect and is thus far weaker. The last line of Blightsteel Colossus is a replacement effect for when it's put into the graveyard from anywhere to instead shuffle it into its owner's library. This clause is designed to prevent you from reanimating it in the early game. However, there are other ways to cheat the card into play with relative ease. Show and Tell lets you put it into play from your hand for just 3 mana, and demands an answer that can actually deal with it pretty much immediately. Your opponent might be able to chump block for a turn, but Trample will ensure a good number of counters still get put on your opponent, which means that they'll most likely have no more than 2 turns to try and answer your Blightsteel before they're dead. Legacy also is home to artifact ramp decks built around Metalworker that can reasonably cast Blightsteel Colossus for its actual mana cost within the first few turns of the game. But the most powerful application of Blightsteel in any format is undoubtedly in Vintage, where Tinker is still legal. Tinker lets you sacrifice any artifact, even a treasure token, to put any artifact in your deck onto the battlefield. With fast mana, like the Moxen, you can consistently cast the 3-mana sorcery and have at least 1 artifact to sacrifice and drop a turn 1 Blightsteel Colossus. Tinker is such a powerful card that it sees play in various strategies in the format, and those Tinker decks tend to include 1 copy of Blightsteel just in case it's the best option to cheat out at the given time to steal a win. Blightsteel isn't quite as scary as it used to be between an increase in both answers to it and other options for cards to cheat out, but it's still easily one of the most threatening Phyrexians ever printed. And at number 8, we have Elesh Norn, Grand Cenobite. This legendary Phyrexian Praetor costs 5 generic mana and 2 white mana, and has 4 power and 7 toughness. Elesh Norn has Vigilance, which means it does not tap to attack, and gives all the creatures you control plus 2 power and toughness, while giving every creature your opponent controls minus 2 power and toughness. This represents a virtual swing of 4 in terms of measuring up stats-wise against your opponent, as all your creatures get bigger and theirs get weaker. Many of the creatures played in competitive decks leverage efficient yet still small stalls. Elesh Norn outright kills creatures like Ravagan, Nimble Pilferer, and other creatures with 2 or less toughness your opponent controls via state-based actions. Some aggro decks are completely stonewalled by Elesh Norn until they manage to remove it, such as Zeus threats like Wild Nicodle feeling utterly declawed while under their effect. While Elesh is quite potent against these creature decks, it conversely is also quite strong in bolstering your own creature strategies. In that regard, Elesh Norn is fantastic at bringing parity in longer games where both players have developed similar sized boards. This has led to her seeing application in more aggressive decks during both her stint in Standard and in Modern and Legacy for many years. As options grew more diverse, she found herself relegated more to being a reanimation target, since cheating her out early would outright counter some decks like Legacy Elves, which relies almost exclusively on 1 toughness creatures. While not the biggest consideration, it is worth noting that Elesh Norn has been a mainstay in Commander for as long as can be. Between the wealth of graveyard-oriented decks and general slower pace of the format, games often run long enough for Elesh Norn to reshape the context of the battlefield. However, the cards ahead of her on this list have seen a good bit more active use in competitive spheres. And at number 7, we have Deceiver Exarch. This Phyrexian Cleric costs 2 generic and 1 blue mana, and has the keyword Flash. This allows you to cast Deceiver anytime you would cast an instant, including during your opponent's turn. When Deceiver Exarch enters the battlefield, you may choose one of 2 abilities, either untapping target permanent you control, or tapping one an opponent controls. At face value, this may look like an unimpressive combat trick that either freezes down your opponent's best attacker, or lets you block with whatever creature you've already tapped. But that's a very basic use of the card, and probably the one that was intended when the card was printed. However, the card launched into competitive play thanks to its synergy with Splinter Twin. This aura costs 2 generic and 2 red mana, and enchants target creature. Enchanted creature gains the ability to tap itself to create a token that's a copy of itself that has haste, but gets exiled at the beginning of the next end step. In competitive Magic, the play pattern you typically see is letting your opponent tap out on turn 3 and end their turn, to which you respond by flashing in Deceiver Exarch, tapping down whatever creature they played. Then, on your turn, you play your 4th land and cast Splinter Twin, enchanting your Exarch. You can then tap the Deceiver Exarch to create a token of Deceiver Exarch that has haste. Exarchs enter the battlefield trigger will then untap the original Deceiver Exarch to then just tap it again and create another token and another untapped trigger. You repeat this process until you have so many copies of Deceiver Exarch with haste you can attack and kill your opponent on turn 4. This was one of the modern format's first consistent turn 4 kills, a 2-card combo that was easy to sneak in when your opponent had no mana available to interact with. Splinter Twin was eventually banned in Modern, and while many argue it could be unbanned today, the fact remains that the combo left a massive impact on the format. Deceiver Exarch, for its part, was important but not integral to the combo. It served as redundancy, as there is another creature, Pestermite, which has the same mana value and near functional identical effect. The main draw of Exarch, as the better of the two, was its higher toughness, which let it dodge damage-based removal. And at number 6, we have Blighted Agent. This Phyrexian human rogue costs 1 generic and 1 blue mana, has 1 power and toughness, and has the previously mentioned keyword Infect. Blighted Angel also cannot be blocked, which means as long as you're able to attack, it serves as a means of sneaking in a poison counter onto your opponent. Of course, this card is hardly used for just poking 1 infect damage a turn. Instead, Blighted Agent and its partner in crime, Glistener Elf, are the backbone creatures of dedicated infect decks. Both are 1-power creatures that can be cast on the first few turns. From there, the aim of the game is to push for lethal as fast as possible by putting together 10 damage with Infect. This is most easily achieved through cheap or even outright free to cast pump spells, like Invigorate, giving targets +4 power and toughness for 0 mana, as long as you control forests, and allow an opponent to gain 3 life. That boost puts your creature to 5 power, and from there you could use something like Berserk in Legacy to double its power for a one-shot kill. One of the biggest weaknesses of a strategy like this is potentially losing your infect creature to removal after you've already invested pump spells into it. Thankfully, there exists a wealth of cheap green spells that provide hexproof at instant speed. Legacy, where Infect has seen the most success in recent years, has access to the 1-mana Legolas's Quick Reflexes, which not only provides hexproof, but does so with Split Second, an ability that makes it so as long as the spell's on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate non-mana abilities. Blighted Agent in particular earns a spot on this list because, despite being slower to cast than Glistener Elf, the addition of Unblockable removes any hope of being able to chump block to survive for another turn and stabilize. Infect is less prominent of a deck as it once was in formats like Modern, but still exists in Legacy and even sees marginal pauper play to this day. And at number 5, we have Spellskite. This artifact creature is a Phyrexian horror that costs 2 generic mana and has 0 power and 4 toughness. You may play 1 Phyrexian blue mana to change the target of a spell or ability to Spellskite. While the ability technically costs blue mana, it costing Phyrexian mana means you can simply pay 2 life instead of that mana. This means Spellskite and its ability are available to essentially any deck regardless of what color of mana it plays. This also means that you don't need to hold up any mana to use the ability. This allows Spellskite to function as a lightning rod, protecting your other permanents from removal or other interaction. In some cases, Spellskite is able to redirect a spell that would kill another creature, but leaves it alive, such as surviving Lightning Bolt since it has 4 toughness. It is important to note you cannot change the target of a spell to an illegal target, so Spellskite won't invalidate a counterspell, but protects from almost anything that can legally target a creature or artifact. While not common, Spellskite can even steal the positive spells your opponents cast, such as an Infect player casting a buff spell that you can simply redirect to buff your Spellskite instead. Decks tend to want Spellskite when they're focused on a few certain key cards that they need undisrupted. One of the most prominent decks currently using Spellskite on the main board is Modern Hammer Time, which sometimes splashes a few copies of it to protect its main creatures, but also provide insulation for the deck's namesake card, Colossus Hammer. Spellskite will most often not survive whatever you redirect towards it, but it forces the opponent to have a follow-up piece of interaction to actually deal with your real threat. Spellskite's main function is to gum up the board and make it difficult for your opponent to disrupt you before you kill them. As such, fair decks don't tend to run the card as much, seeing as how it tends to be more profitable to try and develop a board than focus on protecting a few key cards. But for these more linear or focused decks that desperately need their key cards, Spellskite can often provide protection that a deck in certain colors may otherwise not have access to at all. And at number 4, we have Phyrexian Dreadnought. This artifact creature is, as the name implies, a Phyrexian Dreadnought that costs 1 generic mana with 12 power and toughness and trample. When Phyrexian Dreadnought enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless you sacrifice any number of creatures with total power 12 or greater. This card was designed to exchange creatures you already had on board for 1 powerful body. This is not really good in practice, considering the card is pretty much worthless until you have a large power board already. And then you have to sacrifice all those creatures to trade into 1 card that could be killed with a simple murder. The real power of Phyrexian Dreadnought comes when combined with the unassuming counterspell Stifle. Stifle costs 1 blue mana, and specifically counters target activated or triggered ability. This means on turn 2, you can cast Phyrexian Dreadnought, and then, with the ability on the stack, you cast Stifle. Stifle counters the ability, forcing you to sacrifice cards, and thus you keep Phyrexian Dreadnought. This gives you a rather massive creature super early in the game, one that thanks to Trample can't even be chump blocked. What makes this combination particularly powerful is the low cost of actually playing it. You're not solely focused on cheating out a big threat like a sneak attack deck is, and if your main combo doesn't come together in the first few turns, you're still playing a reasonable blue-based control deck. With a high density of counterspells and other ways of controlling the game's tempo, you can keep the opponent in check until you're drawn to both halves of the combo, and force them to deal with your threat. This deck, referred to as Stifle Knot, has existed in Legacy for some time now, and remains a fringe deck in the format. The printing of cards like Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath have gone a long way in both giving the deck more sustain in the early game, as well as an alternative win condition. This combo of cards has never been printed into Modern together, and thus the strategy is reserved for Eternal formats only. And even then, it's remained at least somewhat relevant for quite some time. And at number 3, we have Wurmcoil Engine. This artifact creature's Phyrexian Worm that costs 6 generic mana and has 6 power and toughness. Wurmcoil Engine has both Death Touch and a lifelink. This means any damage it deals to a creature will be fatal, even if that creature had 100 toughness. And lifelink makes it so any damage a Wurmcoil Engine deals gains you that much life. When Wurmcoil Engine dies, you create 2 Phyrexian Worm artifact creature tokens that both have 3 power and toughness. One of those tokens has Death Touch, the other has lifelink. Essentially, Wurmcoil Engine is a large beatstick that will almost always at least trade in combat, and heals you all the while. And while it does eventually die, it creates 2 tokens to apply further pressure with. That Death Touch token can be held back on defense to check your opponent's strongest threats, while the Lifelink token can help pad your life total a bit more in the mid to late game. The biggest point against Wurmcoil Engine is undoubtedly its mana value, as 6 mana is a bit high for most decks to cast. However, a deck like Tron has no trouble getting up to 7 mana on turn 3 with an optimal opening hand. Wurmcoil Engine feels closer to a 3 or 4 drop in Tron than it does like a 6 drop, and can really put you ahead on board even once it's been removed. This has led to it historically serving as one of the main creature threats that Tron uses. Wurmcoil is fantastic on offense or on defense, and there's rarely a bad time to draw into a Wurmcoil Engine. The Death Touch from both it and the token can protect your game-ending planeswalkers like Karn Liberated, and when you don't need to play defense, Wurmcoil will just tear through your opponent's board and life. While Tron has received plenty of updates over the years, Wurmcoil still remains a playable threat and one of the main creatures they rely on. Even if it's just one singular strategy that really takes advantage of the card, Tron has seen such a dominant mainstay in the format for well over a decade at this point that it's worth a nod for just that alone. And at number 2, we have Sheoldred the Apocalypse. This legendary Phyrexian Praetor costs 2 generic and 2 black mana and has 4 power and 5 toughness. Sheoldred has Death Touch, which we previously discussed, as well as an ability for whenever your opponent draws a card. Whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life, and whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. Sheoldred the Apocalypse technically doesn't do anything when it enters the battlefield, but makes up for it by providing inevitability. Between the life it gains you and drains from your opponent, every turn cycle represents a 4-point swing in total life for just having her sit around. The longer she survives, the more she'll wood away at your opponent while padding your life. If your opponent tries to get aggressive to make up for the swing in life, then you have a large Death Touch blocker, able to comfortably pick apart her board. She essentially demands removal as fast as possible. And even though Modern has many answers to her, the value she offers is hard to pass up on. She also punishes decks that try to draw extra cards, making something like a Brainstorm cost your opponent 6 life in the process of resolving. In the Modern format, she lines up in particularly interesting ways with the One Ring. Since its printing, it's become a mainstay of the Modern format, given the protection it offers on top of a swath of card advantage. If your opponent has the One Ring, it will greatly diminish their ability to use it, as both the Ring and Sheoldred shred through their life total. Conversely, if you have the One Ring, then she'll reward you for drawing those cards by gaining you life and allowing you to more aggressively use the One Ring. While there may be some level of recency bias in including her on this list so high, there's no denying that Sheoldred the Apocalypse is one of the most game-warping Phyrexians we've seen in quite some time. Even at a time where the game is dominated by creatures that offer immediate value upon entering the battlefield, Sheoldred the Apocalypse is a bomb in multiple constructed formats, despite not having an ETB ability at all, and instead offering sheer pressure and inevitability. And finally, at number 1, we have Atraxa Grand Unifier. This legendary Phyrexian angel costs 3 generic, 1 green, 1 white, 1 blue, and 1 black mana, and has 7 power and toughness. Atraxa has 4 keywords we've previously discussed, namely Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, and Lifelink. When Atraxa enters the battlefield, reveal the top 10 cards of your library. And then, for each card type, you may put a card of that type from those revealed cards into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library. This means in a best case scenario, you can add an artifact, battle creature, enchantment, instant, land, planeswalker, tribal, and sorcery card to your hand. Of course, you're unlikely to even be playing all 9 card types, let alone hit them all in your top 10. But still, given how decks are typically constructed, you're on an average going to be drawing between 3 to 5 cards with Atraxa. So not only do you get a massively powerful body, but you also refill your hand in the process. This combination has led her to seem played basically every constructed format. Of course, given her mana cost being so high and so color intensive, basically none of these decks ever aim to actually cast Atraxa naturally. Standard decks were reanimating her with the cruelty of Gix, and some 4 and 5 color control decks actively even did aim to hardcast her, but that's by far the lowest power environment she's seen play. She's far more powerful in formats like Modern, where Goryo's Vengeance and other similar tools can be used to cheat her out in the first couple of turns. Notably, given her variety of colors, this allows her to be pitched for any of the Invoke elements, giving her some applications even if you drew her at a time where you can't cheat her out. When you get to Legacy, not only do you have access to the previously mentioned ways of cheating out fatties, but since she's green, you can also just get her via natural order. Every format has ways of cheating her out, and the value she offers, both when she enters the battlefield and if she sticks around to attack and block, is hard to match. Not only does she fit into more decks than most fatties like this, she's actively started to replace all-star cards like Grizzlebrand which has been the go-to reanimation target for years. Even if she is a fairly new card, there's really no denying the instant and great impact she's had on every Magic the Gathering format. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other fearsome Phyrexians you feel were worth an inclusion? Have any other topics you'd like to see in future videos? If so, let us know down in the comments below.